They tell you Mar-a-Lago was built as a winter escape, a place to rest, a palace of sunlight and leisure, rising out of the palms of Palm Beach, Florida. But that story collapses the moment you ask a more dangerous question. Why would someone build one of the most expensive private estates in the United States at a time when wealth itself was becoming a political liability? Why invest so heavily in visibility, permanence, and scale just as public anger toward elites was hardening into law? And why place it not in isolation, but directly inside a social and political pressure zone that was already changing? The comforting assumption is that old money built big because it could, that excess was the point, that grandeur was simply ego, frozen in stone. But in the early 1920s, when Mar-a-Lago was conceived, American wealth was no longer operating in a safe environment. The country had just passed through the First World War. Income taxes had become permanent. Estate taxes were no longer symbolic. Progressive politics had turned inheritance into a moral target. Newspapers openly debated whether extreme wealth was compatible with democracy. The illusion that money could remain invisible, untouchable, and above the state was already cracking. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because Mar-a-Lago does not look like a response to confidence. It looks like a response to fear. Palm Beach in the year 1920 was not simply a resort. It was a gathering point for America's most exposed families. Railroad fortunes, industrial dynasties, financial empires that had grown too large to hide and too rigid to move. These families understood something the public did not, that the real danger was not collapse, but scrutiny, not poverty, but regulation, not revolution, but paperwork. Laws written slowly, quietly, by people who never set foot inside these estates. Mar-a-Lago was commissioned by Marjorie Merriweather Post, one of the wealthiest women in the United States at the time, whose fortune came from the Postum Cereal Company and later General Foods. Her wealth was not old in the European sense, but it was massive, liquid, and politically visible. By the early 1920s, that visibility carried risk. Congressional debates over taxation were no longer theoretical. Inheritance was being reframed as a social problem. Wealth was being measured, categorized, and prepared for extraction. So the estate that rose between the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth was never just a house. From the beginning, it was positioned as something else, a structure with multiple identities. A residence, yes, but also a potential diplomatic site, a quasi-public space, a property that could plausibly be argued to serve national interests rather than purely private ones. This distinction mattered far more than architecture, because in an era when governments were learning how to reach into private balance sheets, classification could mean survival. The illusion Mar-a-Lago projected was leisure, but the machinery behind it was legal. Its scale was intentional, too large to be dismissed as a simple residence, too complex to be easily taxed like ordinary property, too symbolically valuable to be treated as disposable. The estate contained ballrooms, guest wings, oceanfront access, and carefully curated European design elements that evoked old-world legitimacy rather than new money excess. It did not scream novelty, it whispered continuity, and continuity was protection. In 1927, when Mar-a-Lago was completed, the United States was still telling itself that the excesses of the Gilded Age were over. That regulation had tamed capital, that democracy had reasserted control. But beneath that narrative, elites were adapting, not retreating. They were learning how to anchor wealth to land, culture, and symbolic utility in ways that made it harder to dismantle. This is the part rarely discussed. Real estate at this level was not just shelter for wealth, it was a buffer. Land could be zoned, land could be preserved, land could be repurposed under the language of heritage, diplomacy, or public benefit. Cash could be taxed quickly. Buildings could not. Mar-a-Lago's location was not accidental. Positioned between two bodies of water, it created natural boundaries that were difficult to replicate or subdivide. Its footprint made future redevelopment politically sensitive. Its presence reshaped the surrounding area, drawing other elites, reinforcing zoning decisions that favored preservation over disruption. Power clustering around power, quietly hardening the environment against intrusion. What looks like extravagance begins to resemble strategy when you examine timing. The estate was finished just 2 years before the crash of 1929, just before public anger toward wealth exploded into open hostility, just before the Great Depression reframed luxury as moral failure. And yet Mar-a-Lago did not disappear. It endured, not untouched, but intact, because it was never designed to be merely private. Even in its earliest years, the estate was positioned as something that could outgrow its owner, a place that could host foreign dignitaries, a space that could plausibly be transferred to institutional control rather than liquidated. This mattered. When wealth becomes politically dangerous, converting assets into something the state hesitates to destroy becomes a form of defense. Marjorie Merriweather Post herself would later offer Mar-a-Lago to the United States government as a potential winter White House. That offer failed in practice, but its existence reveals the underlying logic. The estate was always hovering between private luxury and public function, between ownership and stewardship, between excess and utility. This ambiguity is not an accident. It is a survival tactic. The illusion sold to the public was beauty, Mediterranean arches, imported tiles, sunlight pouring through grand windows. But the real work of the estate happened at a different level, in how it was categorized, in how it was talked about, in how difficult it became to treat it like ordinary wealth. This is where nostalgia creeps in. The idea of a calmer era when elites built palaces and society accepted it. But that nostalgia is false. The early 20th century was not calm for the wealthy. It was hostile, unstable, and unpredictable. Strikes, new taxes, political movements explicitly aimed at dismantling concentrated power. Mar-a-Lago was built not at the peak of safety, but at the beginning of exposure, and that changes how you see everything that follows. Because once you understand that the estate was conceived under pressure, not indulgence, the next question becomes unavoidable. If Mar-a-Lago was built as a defensive structure in a time of rising political risk, what happens when that risk does not fade, but intensifies? What happens when the illusion of leisure can no longer conceal the machinery beneath it? And more importantly, what does that say about the way power adapts when it knows the ground beneath it is no longer stable? What rarely survives the photographs is the paperwork. Mar-a-Lago looks like architecture. What sustained it was law. Long before the estate became a symbol, it was engineered as a legal object, shaped by zoning codes, property classifications, and ownership logic that quietly separated it from ordinary private wealth. This is where political survival stops being abstract and becomes procedural. In Palm Beach, Florida, during the late 1920s and early 1930s, land was not neutral. It was governed by layers of local discretion, zoning boards, preservation committees, coastal access rules, and municipal taxation policies all converged on properties like Mar-a-Lago. For most homeowners, these rules were constraints. For estates of this scale, they became tools. The first mechanism was size, not simply grandeur, but fragmentation. Mar-a-Lago was designed as a compound rather than a single residence. Multiple wings, separate guest facilities, distinct service areas. This mattered because classification depended on use. Portions of the estate could plausibly be described as institutional, ceremonial, or temporary lodging rather than purely residential. That ambiguity created flexibility. Flexibility created leverage. Palm Beach officials in the early 20th century were already under pressure. The town's economic survival depended on elite seasonal residents, yet public resentment toward wealth was growing nationally. This produced a quiet compromise. Estates were tolerated, even protected, as long as they reinforced Palm Beach's status and revenue. Mar-a-Lago's presence did exactly that. It anchored prestige. It justified infrastructure spending. It pulled other high-net-worth families into the area, multiplying the tax base without concentrating political blame. This is a recurring pattern in elite survival. Wealth does not confront the state directly. It embeds itself into systems the state becomes dependent on. The land itself played a role. Mar-a-Lago's placement between the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth was not merely aesthetic. It created natural boundaries that complicated jurisdiction. Coastal properties triggered different regulatory considerations than inland estates. Shoreline management, environmental protections, and public access laws layered over each other, slowing intervention and increasing the cost of change. In legal terms, complexity is defense. Ownership structure added another layer. Marjorie Merriweather Post did not treat Mar-a-Lago as a static personal asset. Records indicate that from early on, the estate's future disposition was deliberately left open-ended. This was not indecision. It was optionality. The ability to reclassify an asset as a gift, an institutional site, or a quasi-public facility provided escape routes that liquid wealth did not have. During the 1930s, as the Great Depression hardened public attitudes toward inherited wealth, this optionality became crucial. Cash could be seized through taxation, businesses could be regulated into unprofitability, but large estates tied to land, employment, and symbolic value were harder to attack without collateral damage. They employed locals, they attracted visitors, they could be framed as cultural assets rather than private excess. Mar-a-Lago was expensive to maintain, but that expense itself was protective. High maintenance created jobs, landscaping crews, domestic staff, security, construction and restoration work. This transformed the estate into a local economic node. Attacking it politically meant threatening livelihoods, not just privilege. Again, this was not accidental. Elite architecture often hides labor not out of cruelty, but because visibility of labor destabilizes the illusion. Yet the existence of labor provides political cover. There is a deeper psychological mechanism here. Power that survives learns to blur categories: public and private, luxury and utility, residence and institution. Mar-a-Lago was designed to sit inside that blur. It could host large gatherings without appearing commercial. It could accommodate dignitaries without formally being a government building. It could be defended as nationally useful without surrendering control. This mattered intensely during the period following the Second World War, when the United States entered a new phase of global power and domestic anxiety. Diplomatic visibility became an asset. Hosting foreign leaders was no longer a novelty. It was a signal of relevance. An estate that could plausibly function as a diplomatic environment gained a new layer of protection. Shutting it down or dismantling it would no longer be framed as economic justice, but as cultural vandalism or strategic foolishness. The mechanisms of protection did not announce themselves. They operated quietly, through tax assessments that treated the property differently than comparable residences, through zoning allowances that recognized its unique footprint, through the simple fact that no single authority could easily claim full control over its fate. This is where political survival diverges sharply from moral narratives. The public tends to imagine survival as resistance. In reality, it is absorption. Mar-a-Lago did not resist regulation. It absorbed it. It became too complex to regulate cleanly. One of the most overlooked aspects is how land preservation rhetoric intersected with elite survival strategies. By the mid-20th century, preservation had become a politically acceptable value. Protecting historic sites was framed as cultural responsibility rather than privilege. Mar-a-Lago's age, scale, and stylistic coherence positioned it well for this shift. Once an estate is considered historically significant, its fate becomes entangled with identity, memory, and heritage. These are emotionally expensive to challenge. This is not unique to Mar-a-Lago, but Mar-a-Lago is an unusually clear case. The estate's survival did not depend on secrecy. It depended on legitimacy, on being seen as something more than personal wealth. That legitimacy was constructed piece by piece through legal language, social signaling, and strategic generosity. When Marjorie Merriweather Post later engaged in diplomatic hosting during the Cold War period, entertaining foreign leaders and ambassadors, the estate's role subtly shifted again. It became associated with national presence rather than private indulgence. Even those who resented wealth found it harder to argue against spaces that appeared to serve geopolitical purposes. This is where the line between protection and influence begins to blur. A property that survives political pressure gains something more than safety. It gains relevance. Relevance invites access. Access reshapes power dynamics. The estate's adaptability is its most revealing feature. It did not remain fixed as laws changed. It evolved as political conditions evolved. When privacy was safest, it emphasized exclusivity. When visibility became advantageous, it leaned into spectacle. When institutions gained power, it offered itself as a partner rather than an adversary. This adaptive logic is often misunderstood as opportunism. In reality, it is a form of institutional thinking applied to private wealth. The estate was treated less like a home and more like an organism, responding to environmental stress. There is a cost to this kind of survival. Complexity breeds dependency. Once an estate becomes embedded in legal and political systems, it cannot easily retreat. It must continue to perform its usefulness. It must justify its existence again and again under shifting moral standards. Failure to do so invites scrutiny. This is the tension that Mar-a-Lago carries forward. Its protections are not permanent. They require maintenance. They require relevance. And relevance, once established, has a way of attracting attention that is not always friendly. What began as a strategy to insulate wealth from political hostility quietly transformed the estate into something more exposed than it was ever meant to be. The mechanisms that once diffused risk now concentrate it. The same ambiguity that protected Mar-a-Lago from taxation and regulation also made it a convenient stage. And that raises a question that cannot be avoided. When survival depends on adaptability, at what point does adaptation become entanglement? When does a structure built to avoid political pressure become inseparable from politics itself? Because once that line is crossed, the estate is no longer merely surviving history. It is participating in it. Power does not announce itself through force inside places like this. It announces itself through silence, choreography, and absence. The absence of noise, the absence of friction, the absence of the people who make the entire system function. Mar-a-Lago did not merely exist as stone and land. It existed as a performance, renewed every day by labor that was never meant to be remembered. The illusion of ease depended on a hidden population whose lives were carefully structured around invisibility. This is where political survival intersects with psychology, because legitimacy is not maintained by laws alone. It is maintained by optics. From its earliest years, the estate required an extraordinary workforce. Housekeepers, groundskeepers, cooks, maintenance crews, security staff, seasonal laborers drawn from the surrounding region of Palm Beach, Florida. Their presence was constant, but their visibility was managed. Separate entrances, separate quarters, separate rhythms of movement that ensured guests rarely saw the machinery beneath the experience. This separation was not cruelty. It was necessity. Visibility collapses hierarchy. When power becomes too visible, it invites judgment. The goal was not exploitation, but insulation. Labor existed to make authority appear effortless, natural, and deserved. This is a difficult truth, because the estate's beauty was not merely decorative, it was psychological. Every polished surface, every carefully timed service interaction, every seamless transition from one room to another reinforced a single message. Order exists here. Control exists here. Chaos remains outside the gates. For guests, this created reassurance. For the owners, it created safety. During the early and mid-20th century, American elites were acutely aware that disorder was contagious. Labor unrest, strikes, and class resentment had already disrupted factories and cities. The home, especially one of this scale, became a controlled microstate. Rules were enforced quietly. Deviations were corrected before they were noticed. The appearance of harmony mattered more than comfort. Staff were not merely workers. They were custodians of the illusion. Schedules were designed to avoid overlap between classes. Deliveries occurred at specific hours. Maintenance was done when guests were absent. Even sound was managed. Machinery placed far from public areas. Footsteps softened by carpeting. Voices lowered by custom rather than command. This level of control served a political function. A place that appears calm under pressure suggests legitimacy. If power can maintain order within its own walls, it implies competence beyond them. This is why so many elite estates of the period functioned as social theaters. They were rehearsals for governance, not retreats from it. Mar-a-Lago excelled at this theater. Hosting events was not simply social, it was performative governance. Guests were not only entertained, they were positioned. Seated arrangements reinforced hierarchy. Access to certain rooms implied trust. Proximity to the host implied relevance. These signals mattered deeply in elite circles where influence is rarely stated explicitly. The workers made this possible by remaining unseen. Their invisibility was not accidental, it was engineered. Yet invisibility has a cost. The labor that sustains illusion accumulates resentment quietly, even when conditions are stable, and stability itself is fragile. During economic downturns, staffing levels changed, wages tightened. The same pressures affecting the nation filtered inward. But the illusion could not crack. It had to be preserved even as conditions outside worsened. This is where nostalgia enters the narrative deceptively. People remember these estates as symbols of a more elegant time, a time of manners, order, and clarity. But that elegance was maintained through constant management. It was not natural. It was enforced by routine and reinforced by silence. The workers understood this intuitively. Many spent decades inside environments where their presence was essential but their recognition was minimal. They learned how to move without being seen, how to correct problems before they reached awareness, how to absorb tension so that others never felt it. This is political labor, even if it was never described that way. Because political survival does not depend solely on elites protecting themselves from the state. It depends on preventing visible breakdown. Disorder inside elite spaces signals vulnerability. Vulnerability invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites intervention. Mar-a-Lago's staff were, in this sense, a buffer. They absorbed friction. They translated chaos into routine. They allowed the estate to present continuity even as the world outside shifted violently. Consider the decades following the Second World War. The United States emerged as a global power, but domestically, it was unstable. Civil rights movements, labor movements, anti-war protests. The moral authority of old wealth was being questioned openly. Yet inside estates like Mar-a-Lago, the performance continued uninterrupted. Dinners were served on time. Events unfolded as planned. The illusion of permanence persisted. This continuity was itself a political statement. It suggested that some systems remained untouched by upheaval. That hierarchy still functioned. That control was possible. But this illusion required constant recalibration. As social norms shifted, so did the choreography. Language softened. Appearances diversified selectively. Hospitality became more inclusive in form, if not in substance. The goal was not equality, but legitimacy. To appear aligned with the moment without surrendering structure. Labor adapted accordingly. Staff learned new scripts, new expectations, new forms of discretion. The estate evolved socially without ever relinquishing control. This is where managed optics become critical. Power that survives learns how to display openness without becoming porous. Mar-a-Lago mastered this balance. It could appear welcoming while remaining selective. It could host without conceding authority. It could signal relevance without exposing vulnerability. Yet every system built on invisibility carries a risk. When the unseen becomes visible, the illusion collapses rapidly, and visibility does not always come from rebellion. Sometimes it comes from attention. As the estate's role expanded beyond private hosting into more public functions, the machinery behind the scenes faced new pressure. Media presence increased, security protocols intensified, Labor became more regulated, more documented, more exposed. The very forces that once protected the estate now began to erode its insulation. This is the paradox of survival through performance. The better you are at appearing stable, the more attention you attract. The more attention you attract, the harder it becomes to maintain invisibility. For decades, Mar-a-Lago existed in a controlled equilibrium. Its labor force sustained the illusion. Its optics reinforced legitimacy. Its hierarchy remained intact. But the conditions that made this possible were changing. Slowly, then abruptly, the workers who once remained unseen became part of regulatory frameworks. Labor laws evolved. Media scrutiny increased. Social expectations shifted. The quiet separation that once protected hierarchy now appeared suspect. Transparency became a demand, not a threat. And transparency is hostile to systems built on silence. This is the tension that accumulates beneath the surface of places like Mar-a-Lago. Not moral guilt, structural stress, the stress of maintaining an illusion in an environment that increasingly rewards exposure. The estate survived by adapting its optics, but adaptation has limits. Each layer of visibility strips away some control. Each demand for accountability weakens the choreography. Each new audience introduces unpredictable interpretation. What was once a self-contained performance space begins to resemble a stage without curtains. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If political survival once depended on invisibility, what happens when invisibility is no longer possible? When labor, optics, and hierarchy are forced into the open? When the illusion that sustained legitimacy becomes the very thing under examination? Because when the machinery behind power is exposed, survival requires a different strategy entirely. There comes a moment when insulation fails, not because it was poorly built, but because the environment changes faster than the structure can adapt. For estates like Mar-a-Lago, that moment arrives when wealth stops being merely resented and begins to be interrogated. When protection through ambiguity gives way to pressure through visibility. By the late 20th century, the political climate surrounding elite property had shifted decisively. The question was no longer whether wealth should exist, but whether it could justify itself. Tax law had matured. Media ecosystems had accelerated. Public scrutiny no longer moved at the pace of committees, but at the speed of broadcast. In this environment, the old survival strategy, quiet endurance, was no longer sufficient. Mar-a-Lago faced a choice shared by many elite institutions built for discretion: retreat further into privacy or convert exposure into leverage. Retreat was not an option. The estate was too large, too visible, too embedded in local and national narratives. Maintenance alone required scale. Security required coordination. Silence was no longer protective. It was suspicious. In a culture increasingly hostile to opacity, withdrawal invited investigation. So, the estate adapted. What had once been primarily defensive became performative. The same features that previously blurred the line between private and public were reoriented toward influence. Access, once a risk, became an asset. Hosting shifted from quiet legitimacy to strategic signaling. The estate transformed from a buffer against politics into an instrument within it. This transition did not occur suddenly. It unfolded through incremental decisions, opening parts of the property to broader membership, increasing the frequency of large events, allowing media presence to become normalized rather than resisted. Each step reduced insulation, but increased relevance. Relevance is seductive. It offers protection through indispensability. A place that matters is harder to marginalize. But relevance comes at a cost. Once an estate becomes a stage, it must perform consistently. Its symbolism can no longer be controlled solely by its owners. Interpretation migrates outward. Critics and supporters alike begin to project meaning onto the space. The building itself becomes a participant in political narratives. This is where adaptation shades into compromise. The estate's architecture, once designed to suggest continuity and restraint, began to carry new connotations. Grandeur was no longer read as legitimacy alone. It was read as defiance. Exclusivity became provocation. What once softened scrutiny now intensified it. Political pressure followed predictable channels. Regulatory attention increased. Tax assessments were revisited. Zoning interpretations tightened. Environmental considerations gained weight. None of this constituted an attack, but together they formed a narrowing corridor. Survival required engagement. Engagement, however, alters posture. A structure built to withstand pressure from the outside now had to respond to pressure from within the system. Negotiation replaced insulation. Alignment replaced ambiguity. This shift reveals a deeper truth about elite survival. Protection strategies age. What works in one political era becomes liability in another. Mar-a-Lago's original design assumed a world where discretion was power. The emerging world rewarded spectacle. Spectacle does not erase risk. It redistributes it. Instead of legal vulnerability, there is reputational vulnerability. Instead of taxation battles, there are narrative battles. Power becomes visible not as wealth, but as influence. The estate adapted accordingly. Its role expanded beyond property. It became a meeting point, a signal, a place where proximity conveyed access. Access conveyed relevance. And relevance conferred a different kind of safety, one rooted in attention rather than invisibility. This is not moral transformation. It is strategic recalibration. Yet recalibration carries consequences. Once a space is politicized, neutrality disappears. Every event becomes symbolic. Every gathering becomes evidence. The estate can no longer claim to exist outside politics. It becomes a container for it. This entanglement introduces volatility. Political tides shift faster than architecture. A structure cannot vote. It cannot pivot ideology. It can only absorb meaning imposed upon it. Mar-a-Lago began to absorb more meaning than it was designed to hold. The same openness that generated influence also attracted opposition. The same visibility that provided protection also created targets. Activism, protest, and public debate converged on the estate not because of its function, but because of what it represented. Representation is dangerous terrain. It is unstable. It changes with context. A building that once symbolized continuity can quickly symbolize excess. A space that once implied order can come to signify imbalance. The estate's survival now depended not on hiding from politics, but on navigating it actively. This required constant signaling, constant engagement, constant recalculation of risk. And here lies the moral tension. To remain relevant, the estate had to embrace dynamics that eroded its original insulation. To remain protected, it had to accept exposure. To remain intact, it had to become controversial. This is the paradox of adaptation under pressure. Survival demands compromise. Compromise reshapes identity. Identity attracts judgment. Mar-a-Lago did not collapse under this pressure. But it did not remain unchanged. It crossed a threshold. It became inseparable from political cycles it could not control. Its fate began to rise and fall with narratives beyond its walls. What began as a structure built to outlast political hostility became a structure that magnified it. The defensive logic inverted. Protection through distance was replaced by protection through presence. Presence, however, is exhausting. It requires constant justification, constant performance, constant relevance. And relevance, once lost, is difficult to reclaim. This raises a final, unsettling question for this phase of the story. When an institution built to survive politics becomes dependent on politics for its survival, what happens when the political environment turns hostile? When the attention that once protected it becomes the source of its vulnerability? Because at that point, the estate is no longer adapting to pressure. It is living inside it. And systems that live inside pressure rarely emerge unchanged. There is a point at which survival stops looking like defense and starts looking like exposure. Not because the structure fails, but because the environment no longer allows neutrality. Mar-a-Lago crossed that point quietly, without ceremony. And once it did, there was no return to its original purpose. What remains unfinished is not the building. It is the consequence. By the early 21st century, the estate was no longer judged by what it was, but by what it symbolized. Symbolism is unstable. It detaches objects from intention and attaches them to narrative. Once that happens, control migrates away from owners and into public imagination, media framing, and political conflict. This is the final inversion of political survival. The mechanisms that once shielded the estate now amplify scrutiny. The same visibility that once conveyed legitimacy now attracts polarization, and polarization is corrosive to structures built for continuity. Mar-a-Lago did not become fragile because it was attacked. It became fragile because it mattered too much. Every system designed to endure relies on predictability, predictable laws, predictable norms, predictable limits. But modern political environments are defined by volatility. Norms shift quickly. Legitimacy is renegotiated constantly. Power is challenged not only through institutions, but through attention. Attention is relentless. It does not respect architectural intent. It does not care about historical nuance. It simplifies, amplifies, and distorts. This is where the estate's story stops being unique and starts being instructive. Mar-a-Lago reveals what happens when old survival strategies collide with modern visibility. Land no longer guarantees insulation. Heritage no longer guarantees protection. Complexity no longer guarantees delay. Instead, everything becomes immediate, interpretable, and contestable. The estate now exists in a permanent state of tension. It must remain relevant to justify itself, but relevance keeps it exposed. It must remain symbolic to maintain influence. But symbolism invites opposition. It must remain open enough to matter, but closed enough to control. These goals are mutually incompatible, and yet, walking away is impossible. The estate cannot shrink itself back into discretion. It cannot erase the narratives attached to it. It cannot retreat into obscurity without appearing to concede something. Silence is no longer neutral. It is read as admission, retreat, or weakness. This is the price of adaptation taken too far. What began as a structure designed to survive political pressure now mirrors the very instability it sought to outlast. Its fate fluctuates with news cycles, court calendars, and public sentiment. It no longer absorbs pressure. It reflects it. And this reflection is uncomfortable because it feels familiar. Mar-a-Lago's unresolved tension mirrors the present moment far beyond Palm Beach, Florida. Across institutions, across wealth structures, across political systems, we see the same pattern. Strategies built for one era colliding with conditions they were never meant to face. Insulation turning into exposure, stability turning into spectacle. Old money once believed permanence came from silence, distance, and complexity. New power operates in a world where silence invites suspicion, distance invites irrelevance, and complexity invites attack. The estate sits at the intersection of these worlds, unable to fully belong to either. This raises a deeper question that extends beyond any single property. Can structures designed for endurance survive environments that reward acceleration? Can systems built to outlast political cycles function when cycles collapse into constant motion? Mar-a-Lago suggests the answer is not comforting. Survival now requires visibility. Visibility requires narrative control. Narrative control requires constant engagement, and constant engagement erodes the very insulation that survival once depended on. This is not moral failure. It is structural inevitability. The illusion of permanence has been replaced by the reality of negotiation. Every day, legitimacy must be reasserted. Every symbol must be defended. Every advantage must be justified. The estate has become less like a fortress and more like a negotiation table that never closes. And negotiations never end cleanly. They leave residue, fatigue, uncertainty. This is why the story does not conclude with collapse or triumph. It concludes with suspension, with a structure still standing, but no longer stable in the way it once was. With survival achieved, but at a cost that continues to accumulate. The question is no longer whether Mar-a-Lago will endure physically. Stone can last a long time. Land can persist. What is uncertain is whether the strategy it represents can still function in a world where power is permanently exposed. Because if Mar-a-Lago was built for political survival, its evolution suggests a warning rather than a model. Survival achieved through adaptation can transform protection into dependency, dependency into vulnerability, vulnerability into perpetual conflict. And that leaves us with a question that extends far beyond this estate. If the systems built to survive political pressure now require politics to survive, what happens when the pressure becomes constant? When there is no outside to retreat to? When endurance itself becomes a performance? If you want more investigations like this, stories not about buildings, but about the systems hiding inside them, subscribe. The architecture of power has not stopped evolving.